Today we're going to talk about the effect dates of IEPs. Now typically an IEP has a beginning date and an end date, and that's called an annual. And if you do an annual, you're actually looking at every item on the IEP, and you've indicated that it's an annual. So if you do that, then you have a whole year before you have to meet again. In a perfect world, your begin date lines up perfectly with your end dates, so you don't have any gaps in the process at all. This perfect world seldom happens. So how do we make sure that we're in compliance? The DOE will be taking data right out of the IEPs for things like accommodations and funding. So we have to make sure that we have our beginning and end dates correct. What often happens is there's a begin date and then the IEP is going to end. So instead of planning ahead, we hold the meeting right when it's going to end. Because there's a number of things that go on so that the IEP doesn't really go into effect until much later. And what we end up having is this gap right here, which is problematic. You set the IEP beginning and end dates under schedule a case conference committee meeting, and it's the IEP proposed initiation date and the IEP annual review date. Those dates are going to be a year apart naturally. And what you select there shows up at the top of the IEP in the right corner as IEP effective dates. It also shows up as IEP begin and IEP end dates in your student table. Here are some things that can really gum up this process. If you do not have a parent attend at this meeting and you do not get at this point a notice of implementation, the parent gets an additional 10 days to think about if they like the IEP. In those 10 days, the parent can do any of these 4 things, and it will put a hold on the process of having the IEP in effect. And it requires you to continue to execute this one that's already passed. The solution, of course, is to overlap the IEP number 1 with IEP over 2 so that there's some time in here where you can work through the agreements with the parents. So the question is, when is an IEP initiated? One way they can be initiated is that the parent signs the notice of implementation. When that happens, the IEP can be implemented immediately. The other way is if you wait 10 days. Now this has to be 10 days after the parent receives the IEP. It's important to note that the notice of implementation always refers to the last IEP that was finalized. You might not realize it, but this Easy Facts that's at the very bottom of your IEP links it by code to that last IEP that was finalized. So if you have an IEP that's in draft and you print this Easy Facts, it will not go with the draft IEP. It will go with the last IEP that you finalized. So what you want to do to prepare for this is you want to give some thought to what's going to happen as that end date approaches. There's nothing that requires you to wait until that time. If you schedule the meeting sometime before that, it also does not necessarily have to affect this date by moving it up. What you can do in the IEP is you can establish a new date when it's in effect, and that date can be after the case conference. You should be prepared to finalize at the case conference if at all possible, because then the parent can sign. If you can't do it at the time of the case conference, give yourself maybe a day, but never leave it in draft. Once the IEP is finalized, you want to provide it to the parents. The parents get 10 days. If there is no response from the parent, you can go ahead and implement after those 10 days. This is under the assumption that you gave the parents plenty of opportunities for mutually agreeable time. So the order that you have to think about this is, first you finalize, then you provide it to the parents, and you can either collect the signed notice or wait 10 days. before you can implement. You can also set your implementation date into the future so that you are not scooting your implementation date earlier and earlier every year.